So now that we have a better sense why the transition was made to the from the cardiopulmonary standard to the whole brain standard of death in the medical community, uh, Singer's going to direct us to some critical thoughts. Um, he notes several problems with this definition that we want to kind of be aware of, because those are going to be the basis of his claim that we need a different definition. We're still without sort of a viable medical definition of death. But first, we want to just briefly touch on something he finds interesting, and I sort of do too, which is that historically, when this shift was made, when the Harvard Committee advocated this, and medicine more or less adopted it, and that adoption is now complete. This is the definition that is utilized. There wasn't a lot of opposition, and one of the reasons, according to Singer, that there wasn't much opposition was that even though the Harvard Committee wasn't challenging the accuracy of the cardiopulmonary standard, they weren't saying anything that wasn't basically correct. These irreversible coma cases were very hard on families and hospitals. It wasn't, that was true. And there was this sort of growing need for organs for transplant, and there was this push towards finding a way to get more of them. So there's nothing, it's not as though the Harvard Committee's rationale is false or based on claims that aren't true or aren't accurate. It's just that it's odd that they would advocate changing the definition of death on these sort of practical grounds. And Singer says, look, there are a couple of groups you would have expected to oppose this who did not. One is, he says, is the Roman Catholic Church. Now, why exactly he thinks the Roman Catholic Church? Not entirely clear. It probably has something to do with sort of historical positions on other matters that may be sort of influencing his thinking here. But it does. You might probably, maybe some of you are Catholic, and you might be able to better understand this. You're probably a little more familiar with specifics of the faith than I am. But the point here is just that Singer finds this surprising, that the Roman Catholic Church was not in any way, opposed to this. In fact, back in 1957, Pope Pius XII had sort of reiterated, and this was amidst the sort of discussion about euthanasia in medicine that was also going on. He'd reaffirmed the Church's view that death is when the soul separates from the body. But he had also put the authority for deciding when a patient is dead squarely in the hands of physicians. So basically what Pope Pius XII said was, here's what the Church says death is. When a patient is dead, doctors, that's up to you. That's not, the Church doesn't have a view about that. That's a medical matter, so you guys decide. So they sort of opted out of having any authority or any say over that. Now, the other group that you might have expected opposition from that didn't oppose it whatsoever was the pro-life movement. And in this case, the main sort of cause of the pro-life movement was euthanasia in medicine, and whether this should ever sort of be allowed. And of course, that debate is still going on. The pro-life movement, you might have thought they would be opposed to this because it would mean that a bunch of people who had previously been seen as alive were now going to be sort of taken off of respirators and things like that. However, the way the pro-life movement saw this, sort of officially at least, although probably not publicly, was that it eliminated the most defensible cases of euthanasia. In the debate that was going on at that time, the advocates of euthanasia would point to these irreversible coma cases and say, look, if there's any situation where euthanasia would be permissible in a medical context, it's going to be these cases where individuals are in irreversible comas. They're a major burden on their families and the hospital. There's no hope of recovery. Why would we continue to keep them alive? Why on earth would we do that? And one consequence of the shift to the whole brain standard of death was that those folks are no longer eligible for euthanasia because they're already dead. And so the pro-life movement saw this as a beneficial development for their sort of anti-euthanasia position, because now the pro position was not able to point to these cases and say that if anyone ought to receive euthanasia, it's those folks, because now those folks are dead. They're not candidates. All right. So despite this lack of opposition, Singer does think there are several problems with this definition. One problem he notes is just that this definition seems to sort of privilege the brain in certain sorts of ways, as though the brain is sort of uniquely irreplaceable, that if you lost other kinds of organs, you would not, you're not dead when you don't have a kidney or a liver or something like that. People survive without a thyroid gland, for example. We seem to be able to sort of replace the functions of those organs, at least temporarily. And so there's this assumption that the brain has some sort of privileged status in the body, as though it's uniquely irreplaceable. And Singer says, well, that's not really the case. We can replicate many of the most sort of vital functions of the brain with medical technology. We can't reproduce consciousness, of course, but we can a lot of these sort of regulative tasks that the brain is charged with. We can replicate those with medical technology. So we need to know why the brain has this kind of special status where if we didn't have it, or if it wasn't functioning any longer, we would cease to exist. And Singer thinks, and this is going to come up later when we talk about the higher brain standard that de Grazia is responding to, Singer thinks it's because the brain is the organ most closely associated with consciousness and personality. For a lot of us, once that's gone, we're not going to really think of ourselves as alive. That doesn't mean that we're not, as we're going to discuss again when we get to the de Grazia. Singer's point here is just that this definition seems to privilege the brain in a certain way, and it's not clear why the brain has this special status, such that it's sort of central to the definition of death. Another concern is that if we take the whole brain standard literally as involving no brain function whatsoever, every case of whole brain death is also going to be a case of cardiopulmonary death, because the respiratory and circulation functions of the heart and lungs rely on activity of the brainstem. So anytime there's no activity in the brainstem, there's not going to be any cardiopulmonary activity either. So every case of whole brain death, true whole brain death, is, as it's sort of articulated by the definition, is also going to meet the cardiopulmonary standard. So if we take it too literally, we don't even get a difference with regard to who counts as dead. This sort of highlights one of the problems with the Harvard Committee's discussion of this, which is that they seemed to be focusing on these irreversible coma cases as the basis of their recommendation, and yet they produced a standard that did not sort of speak to those cases. It spoke to something much more total in terms of loss of brain function. So a third problem, according to Singer, is just that nobody believes this definition anyway. Physicians, nurses, journalists, they all struggle to talk about people in these kinds of states, these irreversible coma states, as dead. We say things like, well, the machines are keeping him alive now. You see headlines like, oh, brain dead woman gives birth and then dies. And I think if we look at our own attitudes, we probably have a similar sort of difficulty. We sort of struggle to see someone who is in an irreversible coma but still sort of has is still functioning in virtue of a respirator. We don't see them as dead exactly. We see them as something else, I think. And at least that's how I would tend to think. And I imagine some of you have that similar feeling, is that you don't actually see people in irreversible comas as dead, even though this definition says that they are. And the last problem, and this is kind of a deep problem, so we'll sort of go slow here, is that this definition is legally unstable, according to Singer. Now, what he means by this is that, along with the whole brain standard, there was a legal recommendation for how to verify it. What the Harvard Committee said is this should be verified by electroencephalogram. When you see a totally flat electroencephalogram, so no measurable brain activity by that method, that person qualifies as meeting the standard of whole brain death. They are dead. The problem is that there are other tools for measuring brain activity now, and there are cases where a person will have a flat electroencephalogram, but other means, these other methods, will show brain activity. So we get sort of conflicting readings based on different kinds of technology. But the problem is those alternative means, because you might think, well, just switch to that. But those means are incredibly expensive, and they're in no way beneficial to the patient. It's just sort of a method of detection of brain activity. So the problem here is just that the legal prescriptions of this definition have been completely outpaced by developments in medical technology. And this opens up serious problems for physicians because they might utilize the legally mandated method of verifying that a patient is dead, and someone can then come along and show that, no, this patient actually was not dead. See, this different method shows brain activity. The whole brain criteria says the patient's only dead when there's no brain activity. So you actually should have continued to treat them. You should not have withdrawn care. You should not have taken their organs, what have you, because they actually did not meet the standard described by the whole brain criteria. And the physician would have to try to argue, well, no, I did what the law says I'm supposed to do, even though our technology now tells us that that isn't always the most reliable way to tell that a patient is dead by the whole brain standard. Okay, and another way to put that last point is just that you might say that this standard fails the requirements of a medical definition of death in another way, because although it can, this can be empirically verified in a sort of scientifically legitimate way, it's not practical to do this within the confines of current medical practice. This isn't something that we can do. We can't hook people up to these extremely expensive, complicated machines just for the purpose of verifying that they really are dead. All right, let's just briefly sum up Singer's analysis here. It's basically making 4 points. First, that the switch from a cardiopulmonary standard to a brain-based standard was motivated by practical concerns rather than theoretical ones. This was not a response to anyone thinking that the cardiopulmonary standard was wrong, just that another definition might resolve certain problems that had emerged. According to Singer, nobody opposed this because it was beneficial to everyone affected by it. It was better for the families, it was better for the hospital and the medical staff, it made no difference to the patient, and it also helped out certain groups that you might have thought would be opposed to it, like the pro-life movement, who was dealing with the euthanasia discussion. It turns out, Singer says, nobody actually believes this standard. Nobody thinks that this is really what counts as death. We have this weird scenario where we have defined death in such a way that patients count as dead who we don't think are dead. And that's sort of odd. That's sort of weird. And ultimately, this definition is not viable for roughly the reasons I've given. So what we need is a new standard. But it's not clear where we go from here. Whether we go back to the cardiopulmonary standard or whether there's some other standard that we ought to pursue instead. Okay, so that's going to conclude our discussion of Singer's piece and the sort of shift from the cardiopulmonary to the whole brain standard of death. Your question is about why the pro-life movement didn't oppose this change, so you might need to flip back and just review that if necessary. And in the next clip, we're going to move on to discussion of David Grazia's piece on biological conceptions of death and why he thinks we shouldn't switch to the higher brain standard.